Con ustedes, Salman Rushdie y Paul HOLDENGRÄBER.
He says, the Australian novelist and poet David Malouf tells us that the real enemy of writing is talk. And so I think it's quite interesting that we should be now indulging ourselves in a conversation.
Well, you notice that I'm not writing.
It's true, at this moment you're not writing.
It gets in the way. Anyway, yes, Blake, I've always been a great admirer of Blake. Given that Blake always speaks in a kind of tortuous way, is that what he's talking about is the supremacy of poetry. Right. He's talking, and actually the religious language in that passage is less important.
I would agree.
I mean, that's a kind of pretext. The text is the supremacy of poetry and how everything flows from poetry. In other words, from language and from literature. And if you have the gift of poetry, then you have the greatest gift. And that gift he calls God.
Assert that language is courage, the ability to conceive thought, to speak it, and by doing so, to make it true, which is, after hearing what we just heard, is a tremendously Blakean assertion.
Yeah. It's a book which tries to look at ways in which you can reinvent the world in which you live. Reinvent the world for yourself. Because and what it seemed to me is that if you look at the root, whether you're a psychologist or a mystic, you would understand that the roots of the self are very strongly located in language, you know, the language you grow up speaking.
Which in your case is many.
Well, I was bilingual or trilingual, but you know, language is a very important root, and so is community. You know, the group of people you grow up amongst and who understand you and you know their ways. To it in the way that people respond to the place that they actually come from. You know, and then I thought, well, what's happened to me in my life is that I've left the place that I came from and have made a life for myself in various other places, you know, most crucially London and New York City. And I thought at some point the writing has to recognize that, has to respond to that, you know. And actually the Satanic Verses was the novel in which I thought I was first trying to respond to that, because the novel is about migration, as we were saying, you know. And so this shows you how writers can be wrong about their books. I thought it was the least political book I'd ever written. I thought it was this sort of personal investigation of the consequences to the soul, the spirit of migration. And it was, I mean, the previous books had been much more directly, they'd contained political incidents and so on. I thought this one's personal. It turned out to be, you know, the most political book I'd ever written. But what it led me towards thinking was that we now live in this very, you know, shrunken world in which bits of the world are no longer separate from each other as they used to be. Everything bumps into everything else, you know, and in order to understand the history of one part of the world, you sometimes have to understand what's happened in another part of the world. That the magic is completely in the words. You know, it's true of Alice in Wonderland. It's true of you know, Winnie the Pooh. It's true of The Wind in the Willows. The magic is entirely in the exact sentences. You know, the Humpty Dumpty sitting on the wall, saying, "When I use a word, it means exactly what I want it to mean, neither more nor less." Now, that idea that a word can be made to mean whatever you want it to mean is very radical. You know, I grew up in the biggest movie city in the world. You know, more movies are made in Bombay than anywhere else in the world. Bombay, if you grow up there, you can't, you know, the movies are they're just in your blood. And I feel that I got my education watching those films. You know, I learned more about, well, I became the person that I became as much by watching Jean-Paul Belmondo and Marcello Mastroianni.
There's a subject and there's you having resisted to some extent or having put off.
I didn't want to write it for a long time.
You didn't want to write it?
I didn't want to write it.
And are you enjoying writing about yourself?
Well, that's the bit that, no, I'm enjoying telling the story that I haven't told. I mean, that's the story that I knew that it was, I mean, you know, even when the worst thing in the world is happening to you, if you're a writer, you've got this little imp on your shoulder whispering in your ear saying, good story. Well, I don't want to revisit. I've got other books to write. I wanted to, you know, I became a writer to write fiction, and I've got fiction to write, and I'd much rather do that. So I did that for a long time. And I just thought I'll leave it. One of these days, that voice in my head will say to me, you know, it's time to do it. And that's what happened just about a year and a half ago. I thought, you know, maybe I'll do it. I couldn't be writing this book without that journal. And I always knew that if anybody was going to write the story, I would like to be the first person to write the story. On account of it
the unauthorized autobiography.
Yeah, well, you know, it happened to me,
yeah.
And I'm a writer. So, you know, so get out of my way. This is my story.
Does it have a title yet?
Yes, it does, but I'm not going to tell you.